co-chair of the Parent Coalition for Student Privacy. I see a lot of the allies that we worked with in New York State, the New York State Allies for Public Education, Jeanette and Lisa and Jake, and they led the opt-out movement in New York State, which I don't know whether you were around during Representative Jamal Bowman's presentation, but it really changed the course of history. It was a very successful thing. We had 20% of the parents in New York State opted out of the standardized tests, and it really turned the direction, I think, of education in this country. It also led to our commissioner, John King, being driven out of New York, though he got to be Secretary of Education. He's now running for governor of Maryland, but anyway. And it really turned around our governor, Governor Cuomo, who's a very stubborn, aggressive guy. So it was a very big deal, and they also helped us work very closely with us on privacy. So I'll get to that in a moment. But anyway, my co-chair, Cassie from Illinois, could not be here. Her child was sick. And so I have really so much appreciation for Doug Levin for stepping in. He is the #1 national expert on student and teacher data breaches. So we're really, really thrilled to have him. So I hope you give him a round of applause. I have a formal introduction, but I can't find it right now. So anyway, Doug founded a new company called K12 is that right?
Yeah, a new nonprofit.
Yeah, and so he will talk about that in a little bit, but it's really fantastic that he's here with us today. So, today at this conference, you've heard a lot about privatization. I think it's been a theme that's run through almost every different session. And it's privatization through charter schools, privatization through charters, but I don't think what we've heard about yet is privatization through outsourcing personal student data and teacher data to private corporations in order to take over many of the functions of education, whether it's instruction, assessment, behavior management, and many, many other things. And that is, I think, one of the biggest threats to our public school system, equal to charters and vouchers. And what's unfortunate is during the pandemic, this really accelerated because a lot of schools obviously were shut down. Kids were learning remotely at home. So the acquisition of a lot of these tools was, even in districts that hadn't used a lot of them, used a lot more. And in New York City alone, they offered hundreds and hundreds of products to teachers to use during the pandemic. One other thing that happened during the pandemic that maybe wasn't so terrible was that there was a huge PR campaign by many, many groups, many of them funded by Silicon Valley and the Gates Foundation, saying that personalized learning in the form of online education would radically transform and improve public education. And what we found through the pandemic was that it didn't work, right? And so some kids may have done better with remote learning and online learning, but the vast majority, I think, of kids did not do well. And a lot of the aura and the mystique around online learning, I think, has faded because of our experiences. But unfortunately, we still are saddled with all these programs. So there are 3 federal laws that are supposed to protect student privacy, and all of them were passed by Congress a long time ago, really before the proliferation of ed tech tools was expanded in our schools. So there's FERPA, which many of you have heard of, which originally prohibited the sharing of personal student data with third parties without parental knowledge and consent, and also gave parents the rights to see any personal data of their child in their educational records and ask for correction if they think that it was incorrect. That was passed in '74. In '78, there was the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment, which requires parents to opt out or consent before surveying students about very sensitive personal issues related to political attitudes, religion, antisocial or criminal activities, and family relationships. And then in 1998, the Children's Online Protection Act was passed that required operators of online services to get parental consent before collecting personal data directly from kids online under the age of 13. But that, even when that law was passed, it wasn't really thought about in the context of education at all, and that's caused a lot of confusion. So what happened? In order to encourage and allow for the proliferation and the expanded use of ed tech in online programs, the U.S. Department of Education went ahead and without an act of Congress, they weakened FERPA 2 separate times, one under George Bush and once under Obama, to allow for the sharing of this data without parental consent, and created a lot of loopholes in the law. And there are some arguments to say that they really shouldn't have done that without an act of Congress, but they did it anyway. And then what happened? Something called In Bloom happened. How many of you have heard of In Bloom? Okay, so In Bloom was a $100 million project that turned into a separate corporation by the Gates Foundation that was established in 2013 to collect, systematize, and then share the personal student data from 9 states and districts to encourage private vendors to build their tools around the data. And we found out about it probably first in New York. First it was going to be just New York City, and then they made a huge mistake, probably because John King said, you know, let's go ahead and do it statewide, which was a huge strategic mistake because the parents outside of New York are much easier to organize and get activated than parents inside New York. So we started raising the alarm about this as soon as we heard about it in New York City. And I started writing about it and trying to reach out to parents across the country in the other 9 states and districts. And what was quite amazing is that I've been working in advocacy for more years than I'd like to say. And this really sparked a rebellion across the country that I've never seen the likes of. So parents were contacting me, all alarmed about this, in states and districts that had not made agreements with the Gates Foundation to share their data. Though originally, you know, the Gates Foundation said these 9 states and districts are just the beginning and we're going to grow through all these other states and blah, blah, blah. That's the way they pitched it originally. But it created a real firestorm. And at the same time, it created a new awareness among parents and teachers, including the head of the AFT, Randy Weingarten, who I met with over this because she was initially on the In Bloom advisory board. And she said to me, well, it's FERPA compliant. And I said, well, you know that FERPA has been weakened twice through federal regulation. And she said, no, I had no idea. So I had thought, and many other people had thought, that this was illegal, that you could not do this without telling parents and asking for them. And you know, parents, I think, across the country were not aware of how FERPA had been weakened through federal regulation. So what happened was that all the states and districts that had agreed to share their data with In Bloom pulled out within a few months. It took us the longest in New York because we had John King as our commissioner. But they finally, the state legislature passed a law against In Bloom. And that was very hard to do, especially at that time because we had Republicans controlling the Senate and Democrats controlling the Assembly, and Governor Cuomo, who, you know, was very much always in the hands of the corporate reformers. But the outrage was so great throughout the state. You know, rural communities, suburban communities, New York City even, and the guy who was holding our bill said, you know, and he had been in the Assembly for years, he said, I have Republicans coming up to me in the hallway saying, I need to sign on to your bill. That's never happened to me before. And so it really sort of raised awareness, and all of a sudden it seemed, and people wrote articles, the parents were woken up. In some ways it was like the opt-out movement in that parents really pushed back very successfully. And so In Bloom closed its doors as soon as New York State passed a law against it, because we were the last state that was going to give our data over to it. And then what happened was that it provoked this awareness and this anger in states throughout the country, and at least 43 states passed more than 130 student privacy laws around the country as a result of the In Bloom controversy, which is really quite astonishing. And we had very little to do with that. I mean, it just sort of happened organically. So what do these state laws cover? Many have strong security protections, like requiring encryption for student data. FERPA, which was passed now in the 70s, has no security protections and requirements at all. Some require transparency and that districts need privacy agreements in contracts that regulate what data is being shared, how it's being used, and that parents should have right to access that data as they do in FERPA, even if it's held by the vendor. Few of them deal with protecting teacher data. Many prohibit the use of the sale of student data or its use for marketing purposes. New York does, California does, Illinois does, quite a few other states. Some call for data minimization and data deletion, which we'll get into later. Many require specific time frame that parents and families have to be notified about breaches, and that vendors have to notify districts about breaches. And many call for penalties or fines against the vendors or others that violate their contracts. And so we put out a state student privacy report card that is on our website that you can download at the Parent Coalition for Student Privacy that grades all states according to the student privacy laws. We grade it we put it out with NPE, 7 different categories. There's spreadsheets that have separate grades for each of those categories, and then we average them up. And you can see that New York, Colorado, and a few other states kind of green. I think the best grade that we got, any state got, was a B+. And yet, even in the states where we have the strongest laws, which include California, New York, Colorado, and now Illinois, there are real problems with the enforcement of the law. The transparency promised about what data is being shared is rarely provided. The parent right of access to see that data is rarely provided. Data minimization and deletions rarely happen either, even though they're required by the law. One of the biggest problems is there's no private right of action as in FERPA. What does that mean? It means that parents whose kids have their rights violated or the students themselves cannot sue. So the only enforcement is through the state education department or the state attorney general's office, and they're very loath to take action. So we have been waiting years for our state education department to take action and our state AG against certain companies that I'll talk about next. Now, there are so many companies to worry about. I mean, literally hundreds of them, but these are just some of them that have come up in our work recently, so I just wanted, and these are companies that have contracts or at least agreements throughout the country. There's GoGuardian, which is a student surveillance or spyware program that with remote learning was required to be on a lot of students' laptops or even home laptops to protect against them cheating and to make sure that they were paying attention and doing their homework. And what they found in Chicago is that if the program is wrongly configured, it can literally spy into families' homes when you're not using the program. So it can see through the computer into families' homes. So that's something that's of great concern. The College Board, we've been fighting for, it seems like 100 years. They continue to sell student data, even though that's illegal in New York, California, Illinois, and many other states. We've tried to get AGs to come out against them. We have failed. Lisa knows that the College Board tried to change our law through the rewriting of regulation, and we had a meeting in Albany with our State Board of Education because they make $100 million a year off the selling of student data without parental consent even. When kids sign up for these classes, either online or before the administration of AP, PSAT, and SAT tests, they do surveys where they ask them very confidential questions often, and then they sell that data to colleges to use for their marketing. And what parents don't even know is they say, we do not sell scores, but what they don't tell you is they sell score ranges within a range. So if your child, for example, is applying to a college which is score optional, because maybe they didn't do so well on their SATs, little do they know that the College Board may have already sold their score ranges to that college. Naviance, there was recently some really blockbuster articles in a publication called The Markup. How many of you have heard of Naviance or your kids? So they're in practically, I don't know, they weren't in my kids' school, but they're all over the country. They help you apply to colleges, so you can apply through the Naviance app. They do surveys of kids to try to find out their interests and track them to different careers or programs, give recommendations about what colleges they should go to. Sometimes they track them into more advanced classes than other classes. I mean, they have an enormous influence within schools, and rarely are parents even told about the surveys that they give. But what recently came out is that they don't sell the data directly to the colleges the way a college board does, but like Facebook, they allow colleges to target specific kids based upon their interests, their race, their economic status, and others. So Markup found that for example, in Kansas, they were allowing the Kansas University system to market only to white children and not black children, which is really quite shocking. Then something I've come up with in New York City, I hear it's all over the country, I know it's in California, something called the Kinza thermometer that was given away free to parents in many districts in order to stem the transmission of COVID. And what it is, it's a fever thermometer that parents get for free, and then the data is transmitted electronically to the company. And what we found, I don't think that even though we have it in New York City and many other places, we couldn't get a contract for them. We don't know what the privacy protections are. But the online privacy policy said we use the data to market to families. So they may be marketing products based upon the kids' fevers. And it was unclear in their policy whether the data was even encrypted. So there's also one thing that we found that's really drives me crazy is there's a proliferation of surveys given in schools for social emotional screening, right? So everybody's concerned that they, even before COVID, that we want to do social emotional learning, we want to teach the whole child. How do we do that if we don't know what the kid's emotional, psychological state is, right? And so they call them screeners, that even though they are actually surveys that are regulated by the PPRA that cannot be given without either parental consent or parental opt-out. If it's a mandatory screening, it would require parental consent. In any case, parents are supposed to be told beforehand and be given permission to see the survey if it deals with these sensitive areas. And the number of school districts who are doing this and completely violating the law, ignoring the law completely, is huge. Some screeners we've seen, for example, from the state of Washington, ask incredibly intrusive questions about family relationships, parent or child use of alcohol and drugs, sexual and gender identity, et cetera, et cetera. And then they use that data in order to refer kids to counseling. Breaches proliferate. Now, Doug is going to talk a lot about this, so I'm not going to go much into it, except that in New York City, we suffered probably the largest breach ever suffered by a single district. At least that's what Doug said, and he's the expert. 820,000 students in New York City, going back to the year 2016, had been breached by a company called Illuminate, and now we have evidence that that breach may be statewide and also may have occurred in Connecticut and Colorado. And they produce many different apps, Schedula, IO Classroom, Pupil Path. Schedula was actually invented by New York City teachers, then sold to one company, and then they sold it to Illuminate. We had shutdowns in January of the system. They wouldn't tell us what was really happening. A lot of people, including me, wrote that we're worried that the breaches, State Department, they weren't told about it either. It seemed to happen during that shutdown, and it may have happened. If you look at the agreement, which they finally sent me, I spoiled for all these agreements like 2 or 3 years ago. The day they announced this breach, they sent me 900 pages of contracts for only 18 products, by the way, and we use hundreds of them. So Park, who's here, works with me, had to go and actually created a table of contents for 900 pages of contracts. And what it seemed to say is that it may have happened when they transferred the data from a Google cloud that may not have been encrypted to an Amazon cloud. And there was all sorts of stuff in the contract that said that if you transfer that data, first of all, it's supposed to be encrypted in motion anyway, but if you transfer that data, you need special permission from a division of technology in the city government to make sure that it doesn't leak, and I don't know whether that happened. So how should these security privacy practices be improved? Oops. I'm sure Doug will have a lot more to say about this too. This is just my feeling. First of all, teachers should never use Clickwrap Agreements, which are these free products that say, you know, click here and you can use this product, because if you're getting a product for free, they're making money somehow off that product. And generally speaking, they're making money somehow by using the student data for profit. Disallow any use of programs or apps not screened by the district or the state for their privacy and security protections. Require strong encryption and independent privacy and security audits. That was also in the contract with Illuminate, that they said they required independent audits, and as far as I know, they never happened, so DOE never asked them to produce their independent audits. Minimize the vendor access only to data that they absolutely need to use to operate the system or the program. What happens is DOE still doesn't know what data the vendor got a hold of, and they have a really weird thing in the contract that they say to the vendor, it's your responsibility under FERPA only to access and use the data that you need for your program. And what I told the DOE Chief Privacy Officer is the FERPA is a law that refers only to the district. You cannot hand off your legal responsibility to the vendor and say it's their responsibility under FERPA. That's your responsibility under the FERPA. And actually, the Chief Privacy Officer said to me a couple years ago at a meeting, well, I guess you understand FERPA better than I do, which is kind of shocking in itself because I don't even have a law degree and that's his job. And you know, he's the Chief Privacy Officer for the largest school district in the country. And then the most important thing, I think, is to require the vendor in the contract to delete the data as soon as possible and at least by the time the student graduates or leaves the district. I think there are a couple districts that are around the country, including Montgomery County, Maryland, that have a data deletion day every year where they tell the vendors that they have to delete certain amounts of data. There was a huge Pearson breach a few years ago that many districts across the country suffered. In New York, personal student data breached for students that had graduated years ago, and we no longer had any contract for that app anymore. And they were holding on to it, and it just breached. One thing we really disagree with the New York City CPO about is that even though it's required in the law to say when is the data going to be deleted, they say whenever our contract, they don't say a date, they say whenever our contract with this particular vendor, whenever we have no more contracts with this vendor. So anytime they still have a contract with Pearson, which sells millions of products, many products to New York City and New York State, they're basically giving Pearson the permission to hold on to all that data forever. And I said, that's not what the law says. You need a specific date, and it's when that program contract lapses, and they won't even tell us when that is. So that's just encouraging, irresponsible. And oh, and then he said back to me, well, how will the vendor know where they got the data? And I said, you mean they're merging all this data? That should be illegal too. So of course they should know where the data comes from and which program. So there's just one more thing that I want to tell you about before I give it over to Doug, which is a national issue that we're involved in and very concerned about, and we really want to get the word out about it. There's a bill in Congress that's called the College Transparency Act. How many of you have heard of it? Oh, good. There are a few people who've heard of it. Well, you work for me, so of course you've heard of it. And Jake has heard of it. So this is a bill that we've been fighting for years. It was the top priority of the Gates Foundation back in 2014, along with InBloom. And we thought, and it sort of disappeared from view, it never got anywhere. And then unknown to anybody, because they didn't hold any public hearings on it, there were no news articles about it or anything, the House passed something called the College Transparency Act, which authorizes the federal government to track the personal student data of every student who's ever enrolled in college throughout their entire lives. The information that they're going to collect directly from college include their names, age, grades, test scores, attendance, race, ethnicity, gender, economic status, along with their disabilities and their status as a confined or incarcerated individual. As students move through life, this data can be matched with their data from other federal agencies, including the Census Bureau, the Department of Defense, the Social Security Administration, and perhaps others. There's no ability for students ever to opt out or have their data deleted. And here is, you can send a message to Congress opposing this bill from our website, the Parent Coalition for Student Privacy. And the most important, the really sad thing about this is that the only people I've been able, almost only, I mean, I did call up our Representative Jamal Bowman, who's a personal friend, who was a principal in New York City, and he immediately saw what was wrong with it, and he contacted a couple of his buddies on the Progressive Caucus, including AOC, so I think maybe 5 Democrats voted against it in the House. Many more Republicans voted against it, and working with Congress so far, there's one senator who's concerned about it, Senator Wyden, but the vast majority of senators who are concerned about this are Republicans. And so the Senate, the Democratic Party, we had a session with Senator Durbin's staff the other day and with his constituents in Illinois. I really respect Senator Durbin on a whole host of issues, but they were very, very resistant to even considering not supporting this law. So anyway, I hope that you will, wherever you come from, you will reach out to your senators. It's going to conference committee in the next few weeks. Whatever comes out of conference committee will end up probably being passed into law. The Senate has not passed it officially, but the chief sponsor of the bill in the Senate, and you'll never guess who it is. I will give $100 to him. If I haven't told you, I told him. Guess who it is? Who's your #1 hero in the Senate besides Bernie Sanders?
Okay.
Elizabeth Warren.
Why? What's the reason?
I was going to ask,
The reasoning is accountability. We need accountability. Somebody said it's like ed reform, go to college. Remember with No Child Left Behind, and then under Obama, it's like we need test scores, we need to know what happens to these kids, we need to rate schools according to the test scores, and then close them down and rate their teachers that way. So the more outcome data we have of kids throughout their entire lives, that's how we're going to rate colleges. And you know what they claim? That parents and students are clamoring for this information. And there's already something called the College Scorecard, which the federal government puts out every year, which has much of this information already, which they get from the federal loan program, because you have to give income information from that, and the federal government has hardly used it at all. So, and there are other ways of tracking this data and collecting it. You can get colleges to give you, which they already do for the College Scorecard, for example, aggregate data that does not identify individuals, and you can get other sources of information that they want in other ways without having to get the personal information and track kids through life. So we think that not only does it hugely violate privacy, could be hugely abusive if it's used the wrong way, could clearly breach, because the federal government FAFSA data has breached over and over. And I was just quoted in an article about if you go to the FAFSA site and enter your information into there, it was going to Facebook. And then Facebook was saying, well, we don't know what happens to the data that we get from the FAFSA. So, I mean, they are not responsible parties. And then finally, do you really want to rate all colleges on the income of their graduates? Is that the only thing that we should be looking at? What about, for example, kids who go into teaching, which does not tend to be one of the highest paid professions, as you guys know? Do we really want colleges downgraded? Will colleges then discourage kids or close their teaching programs because they know teachers don't make a lot of money? There are so many reasons to be against this bill, I can't tell you. And we are really fighting a very hard battle, so we need to get the word out, and we appreciate your help in doing so. And just one more thing, so we do have parent toolkits for student privacy that can be downloaded from our website, and we have free copies of Educators Toolkit for student, teacher and student privacy, and there are more in that box there, but everyone here will get a free copy. So now, Doug. One of the hardest things about this issue is that I've had to learn a lot about the law, and the law, privacy law, tends to be extremely complicated and full of loopholes and ambiguities, but the hardest thing is this data security stuff, and you really need a real background in tech to understand a lot of this stuff, so that's why I'm so grateful that Doug is here.
Thanks, and I will say that,
there is absolutely an overlap between the privacy discussion and the security conversation, but it is not 100% overlap. And I'm sure, like me, all of you have gotten those notices in the mail. We take your privacy and security very seriously. However, we have to inform you that blah, 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 blah. You might want to check your credit record, blah, blah, blah. So that is the conversation about cybersecurity. And I think that the big takeaway is that schools are absolutely relying on technology more than they ever have before. I think it's only more likely they will rely on it even more in the future. But right now, the difference between sort of their reliance on technology and their ability to protect their school communities is the gap is huge, right? And unless action is taken, pretty decisive action, and quickly, we're going to have to see incident after incident after incident until we build up the will to take action to actually prevent these from happening. So I do want to sort of start actually with some definitions, because there is some terminology here in the security world that's important to understand. Obviously, this is an issue facing every sector. This is not just a schools issue, but I think in the schools community, it is newer to us. And I sort of like this image because you can put security in place, but if you don't really understand why you're doing it, it doesn't work, and you can create sort of other sorts of problems, right? So clearly, whatever purpose this door lock was serving, it is not serving now, right? So, I mentioned, there's a number of terms, particularly in K12, where we confound cybersecurity with other issues that it is related to, like internet safety or online safety or even cyberbullying, right? And that's really, sort of related. It's happening online. It is absolutely affecting kids. In response, we've seen digital citizenship or media literacy programs crop up, and that's about trying to figure out what is truth from fiction. That's a disinformation is a huge problem online, right? We talk about physical safety in schools, right? So there's concerns about keeping kids safe, and there have been programs for years, for better or for worse, well operated or not, to try to protect kids from physical risks. Right? But many of those are actually predicated on technology, like surveillance cameras and automated door locks, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, this conversation of student data privacy, but I think, from my point of view, if you go into this conversation just through the lens of student data privacy, it is sort of like putting on those horse blinders, and you're going to get blindsided by some other real issues that are happening in schools that don't fit neatly in the student data privacy conversation for exactly the reason that Leonie said, which is that in the original passage of FERPA, it wasn't a security law, and most of the state privacy laws, while they have some security features in them, are not primarily security laws. So in the cybersecurity world, what we are concerned about, broadly speaking, is protecting the boxes and wires and all of the data and systems and people connected to them, right? From everything. And by everything, there's really three things. There's a triad of things that we care about in cybersecurity. One is confidentiality, right? So we understand what that means. Only the people who are authorized to see private information should have access to it. Integrity of that information, right? So no one should go in and change it who is not authorized to do that. We all laugh at Ferris Bueller and in war games, kids going in and changing their grades. But there's lots of reasons people go in and may modify and change that data. And then because we rely on that technology for the day-to-day work of schools, it needs to remain available. Right? And there are schools, plenty of examples of schools that have experienced cybersecurity incidents where they've had to literally shut down school and send kids home. And I say that not even in a time of remote learning, in sort of regular face-to-face operations, have to shut down operations, send kids home. They can't access instruction, they can't access their phone systems, they can't lock the doors, so we can't route the buses, we can't do point of sale in the cafeteria, right? So we can't serve the kids, right? And so obviously that creates all sorts of havoc, and the kids then are missing out. I'm not really going to go through these, but I can in the interest of time. But there's some sort of terminology in the way that we think about cybersecurity and sort of where it fits and in sort of how to think about it. But what I want to sort of share with you is some data that I have been collecting for 6 years. And it's on something I call the K12 Cyber Incident Map. And about 6 years ago, I started seeing stories of school districts experiencing cybersecurity incidents. At one level, I was surprised because I hadn't seen a lot of conversation about it. And I knew that schools were suffering from denial of service attacks, often during testing or at the end of a quarter. I knew, obviously, that there was malware and that people were getting and probably phishing attacks. But I wasn't, you know, I presumed it was sort of an annoyance for schools. But the attacks I started seeing were pretty significant. And so I went looking for information and data on what the trends were, who was attacking schools, how schools were responding. And I found nothing that really spoke to schools as I know them, right, as public schools. Because the cybersecurity industry, when they look at education, they're looking at it at a very meta level. They combine public and private, K12 and higher ed, and it's a global industry. So they'll say, oh, you know, ransomware is a big deal in education, but they'll be talking about what happened in universities. I'm like, well, that's interesting, but I want to know about schools. And so what I started to do was to collect information about publicly disclosed cybersecurity incidents affecting public school districts across the US. And I portrayed that on a map, right? And that's available actually at k126.org/map. Each little pin there is an individual incident. Those sort of green and yellow splotchy things are actually multiple incidents, and you need to zoom in on the map to see those individual pins. And you can click on those pins and learn a little bit more about each of those incidents. But we've got a more robust data set behind that, and I've now written 4 annual reports based on the trends in these data. And the latest was just released about 6 weeks ago, right? So what I'd like to do is, you know, share some of that quickly with you so you get a big sense of kind of what's going on. And so you can sort of take my word for this here, but I do share my data with other sort of entities when it makes sort of sense for the public good. And one of those is the US GAO, which actually did this study in 2020 based wholly on my data set. And they're actually working right now on a follow-up study that I would expect out at the end of the calendar year or so. We'll see, but it'll be related broadly to this issue. I do want to caveat that what I know is about publicly disclosed incidents. So if you see that sort of iceberg there, I'm seeing the part of the iceberg above the waterline. I don't really know what's below the waterline, except that what I hear anecdotally. And that is from school district IT professionals, from vendors who serve school districts. That easily, there could be 10 to 20 times more incidents occurring than I am capturing in public disclosures, right? And that speaks to a big challenge here, which is the issue of public disclosure, because as you might imagine, schools and even school vendors do not run to scream from the rooftops when they've had an incident because it may be embarrassing to them or cost them trust with their community. But nonetheless, there is a compelling need, an argument to be made to have more transparency here. And in the report, I do call out a number of investigative reporters who did excellent work over the last year through primarily freedom of information requests of school districts across their states, in Texas, in California, in Illinois, right? To find out about incidents that had never been publicly disclosed, right? And without that work, I would have known even less, right? So really, a really critical tool. So this is a depiction of the growth in cybersecurity incidents from 2016 when I first started tracking to the end of the 2021 calendar year. It shows 1,331 incidents across an array of incident types. The orange bar along the bottom, the biggest portion of that graph, represent data breaches, right? That's the most commonly reported type of incident that schools are experiencing. And the reason it's the most commonly reported is because it is the only incident type where there is actually some state law that requires some reporting depending on the nature of the incident and which state you are in, because this is not a federal requirement, but a state requirement. The majority of those data breaches involve student data. A good proportion of them, though, are employee data. And there is some proportion that is a combination of both, right? The second bar from the bottom there, the gray bar, represents ransomware. And this is a growing threat facing school districts. It's essentially a tactic used by online criminals to extort their victims for money. You know, these are professional criminals working in gangs, largely based overseas in countries that US law enforcement can't easily reach them. They actually could care less what their victims do and who they're serving. They'll hit healthcare organizations, schools, critical infrastructure, etc. And certainly, there's no company or type of organization that is immune to these attacks. But it is a growing concern in K12. The next bar there is represented as BEC. So that's a cybersecurity term of art. It stands for business email compromise. It is a type of phishing attack, email phishing attack, where someone's trying to trick the recipient of the email into giving some information. The business email compromise attacks are either targeted against individual employees in school districts, right, or the school district as an entity itself. So for individual teachers, there's a very well-tread scam, it's a gift card scam, where a teacher is contacted not by their principal, but by somebody who says that it's their principal or supervisor. Can you please quickly go to Target or Walmart, buy $500 in gift cards because I'm going to be recognizing some other school employees. I'll pay you back, right? And then the teacher then does that and then sends the codes for the cards to them via email as requested. And of course, it's a criminal doing this and not actually the principal. They also target teachers to get their payroll, like access to their payroll system, so they can redirect those payroll accounts to criminal bank accounts as opposed to their own checking account. And there have been a number of school districts where, when the payroll time comes, a few hundred teachers find that they didn't get their paychecks, right, because it went to criminals. Against school districts themselves, they're primarily trying to get in between school districts and payments of their contractors. Often during school construction projects, because those are really big checks, right? And so a school district might write a check of $1 million in a school construction project, and of course it is public knowledge that they're doing school construction. It's public knowledge who that vendor is, right? It's probably on the school district website, who's in the business office, right? So there's a lot of information these common criminals can go after, and in some cases they've stolen $1, $2, $3, even up to $4 million from a district and a go in these sorts of attacks. And as you might imagine, that is a pretty hard thing for a school district to swallow when they lose that amount of money. And sometimes they can get it back, but often they cannot. Other types of incidents, I mentioned denial of service attacks, right? Largely these are likely carried out actually by students themselves or people connected to the school district, though not always. There was a new category of incidents that arose during the time of COVID and the rise of remote learning. We have termed them sort of online class and meeting invasions, right? So if you think about home invasion or a classroom, someone who physically came off the street and walked into a classroom and started spitting anti-Semitic and racist stuff and then dropped their pants, like, it would be a big deal, right? So folks may know these incidents as Zoom bombing, but we don't like that term so much because Zoom was not the only platform this was happening on, and it absolutely was terrorizing school districts all across the country on a range of platforms. Thankfully, those seem to have diminished as kids have come back to school, but not entirely, and they still do occasionally get school board meetings or PTA meetings that are offering a hybrid option or still meeting online. And then, of course, there's a wide array of other types of sort of a long tail type of incidents that still happen to schools: website defacement, social media account takeover and defacement. And that's going to be pretty horrific, right? Because you just can't call up Twitter or Facebook and say, hey, the school lost control of the account. It is saying like racist things here. The community is going crazy. But as the superintendent, I'm telling you, we are not saying these things. And it could be 48 hours or longer before anybody at those companies even does anything to get control of those accounts back, right?
But aren't some of these categories like intersecting each other? Because I mean,
Sure. Yeah.
the ransomware is saying we will breach your data if you don't give us money, right? And so how do you differentiate those things?
So there is more of an art than a science to that. Absolutely, these incidents can be co-occurring, right? So phishing is a common mechanism that could lead to a data breach or the delivery of ransomware. As you know, Leonie, ransomware has evolved, and so it now routinely involves data exfiltration, stealing of data, alongside the encryption of systems, right? So, I think the larger trends are kind of what's important here, not as much of the differentiation, the hard differentiation between categories. But I mean, as I said, this has shut down schools and caused them to lose access to these online systems, in some cases for weeks or months, right? And in some cases, data has just been lost, destroyed, never to come back again. We have absolutely seen identity theft happen to both school employees and to students as young as first graders. And what many folks don't understand is that the identity information of minors is much more valuable to criminals than adults. And while that may seem counterintuitive, because you and I have checking accounts and credit cards, and we've probably had to change our credit card numbers because they have been stolen, right? But the fact of the matter is that young kids, it can be years and years, right, before they ever find out that there's an issue with their identity and their credit has been ruined, right? Because there is no one they have a business relationship with who is monitoring that for them. So it may be when they fill out that FAFSA and try to get that student loan, right? Or they move out of the house and they try to get a lease, right? Or they get that first car, or that first credit card. And that's when they find out. And so that is why it is so valuable to criminals. And we have stories of school districts, in fact, in Toledo, Ohio, at the beginning of last school year, experienced a ransomware incident. Didn't end up disrupting school very long. They were able to contain it. But it later came out that they lost a huge amount of student and employee data. And within that school year, parents of first graders were getting mailed solicitations to their homes in their children's name, with offers for, cars and credit cards, because someone else had already opened accounts in their name and was abusing them, right? And so then now the marketers heard about it and were trying to get them to get another credit card, et cetera, right? So, big deal, right? Obviously stolen and extorted money. It would not be unusual in a ransomware incident for an extortion demand to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not low millions of dollars. But what is not captured by those numbers is the cost to remediate and recover. And you look at what happened in both the Buffalo schools, which was hit with a ransomware attack in Baltimore County, right? Both of them are estimating recovery and remediation costs of roughly $10 million, right? In sort of the shorter to medium term. That's not in the immediate response to that incident, and I don't know whether or not they paid, right? Or their insurance company on their behalf, right? This is now leading to the collapse of actually the cyber liability insurance market. There was some data that had come out that cyber liability insurance providers were losing $4 for every dollar they took in, right? They completely underestimated the risks in the market. And again, that's not just schools, but I guarantee you this July, there will be many, many school districts who will not be able to qualify to get cyber liability insurance because the prerequisites that these insurers need organizations to have before they're willing to write a policy are unlikely to be met by many school districts, right? For whom this is largely a new issue, right? And then, of course, you have the ability to lose the trust of your school community if you need to float another bond, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, especially if you maybe pushed a big technology initiative, right? And so you can understand why some people might want to be quiet about it. This is just a picture of what last year looked like. Again, a wide array of incidents. What changed in this last year was that ransomware was the most frequently experienced type of incident that was disclosed. That's the first time ever, right? It has always been data breaches up until this point. And so we see ransomware getting both more virulent. The amount of money they're extorting is going up. It is routinely involving the stealing of data about students and staff. In many cases, because of a lack of sort of data management and data handling and data deletion, in some cases 5 and 10 years of historical data or more, right, being held by school districts that is breached, right? And we're also seeing the rise now of something called triple extortion, where we've seen threat actors contact parents directly because they're able to get that contact information from the breach, and they're directly communicating to the parents about how poor the school district cybersecurity practices are, and they should reach back out to the school district and get them back to the negotiating table to pay to make sure that their students' data is protected.
Do they ever ask the parents to pay?
Not yet that we've seen.
That would be a good strategy.
So we don't need to encourage them anymore. So just looking in just at the issue of data breaches, I want to sort of pick up on sort of who's responsible for these sorts of incidents, right? So over the last 6 years, this is the most commonly experienced type of incident. And there's a number of parties that are responsible for these types of incidents. So you have students. So I was joking about Ferris Bueller, but I promise you, any school district that serves middle and high school students, there are some tech-savvy students who are doing free pen testing on the district right now. In many cases, these are kids being kids, right? But in some cases, these kids will push the line, right? And they will, they're interested in doing things like maybe changing their grades, lunch account balances, their absences, and things like that. Or for friends, or maybe for a little bit of money, they would change yours, etc., right? So, I mean, kids' behavior sort of goes up along a spectrum, like it does for all things. You see that staff are responsible for about 14%, right? Those are largely mistakes, almost exclusively mistakes. They email out data to a list when it was supposed to go to one person. They post something on a public website when it was not supposed to be public, or a shared drive, right? It's a school board meeting and they're posting information that should have been private in a public space, right? So this is in some ways a training issue, right? It could be even actually a FOIA, request was not properly redacted, right? So mistakes happen, right? And then, about a quarter of the incidents, it's hard to know who is the root of them, but it's also, that's where you're going to get the online criminals are sitting in that group. But the largest group are K12 vendors and suppliers, which is an issue that we have not talked about as much. And so this is just a sampling of companies in education that have experienced security incidents over the last 6 years, right? Just a sampling. And it's a lot of big ones, right, that we know, right? And I think this is more common than we realize. The Illuminate education example that Leonie mentioned is really interesting because we actually know very little about what happened. And until we know what happened, it's really hard to know whether or not it's going to get fixed, and we should trust it was fixed, right? But as Leonie mentioned, it certainly happened in New York City schools. We actually now know that it has happened across the state of New York. And it has happened, and it has also wrapped up schools both in Colorado and Connecticut. So it looks like a nationwide breach. This is similar to the Pearson Ames Web 1.0 breach that happened just a couple of years ago. The company itself it still to this date has not given numbers on its on the number of sort of records that were breached, but it could be hundreds of millions, right? But we don't know for sure because we need to rely on individual reports from individual districts that they were wrapped up in this, right? So definitely
And
something.
they were told by the FBI about the breach, and they didn't contact the districts till like 6 months later.
Oh, or longer, or 9 months later.
Which violates our state law and many state laws,
Right.
and could have led to Pearson being disallowed as a vendor in New York State, only our state education department did not do that.
Right. So let me sort of pivot to sort of how we get here and how does it get better. So I joke that these are the 4 horsemen of the K12 cyber apocalypse, right? So denial, right? So I think a lot of folks in schools are like, why would this happen to us, right? Why would you go after school? We don't have any money. We don't have anything of value. But I think this is a sort of a lack of, you know, I mean, the fact of the matter is if you're online, and that includes you and I, you're a target, right? You use a computer, you plug it into the internet. You know, this is 2022. The delusion is that anything they have is you know, that schools don't have things of value, right? What value are grades? Schools don't have money. But the fact of the matter is actually schools manage a huge amount of money. Huge amount of money. They just don't have enough money to do everything that they need to do for kids, right? But you know, in my local community, I'm in Arlington, Virginia. It's half of our local budget. It's, you know, in many communities as well. I mean, it's huge. There are, you know, school districts with $billion annual budgets. Boy, oh boy, that is more than enough to get an online criminal interested in that organization.
New York City's budget for schools is over $30 billion
A year. Oh, boy. Yeah, right. So, and then all that data itself, right? And identity information, particularly of minors, is really valuable, right?
And there's special education information, there's economic information, there's
immigration,
immigration information,
law enforcement, health information.
there's disciplinary data. I mean, parents,
Right.
I don't think
Right.
are not concerned or unconcerned about this issue because they feel very, very strongly that they don't want their kids' data being breached on the internet, and yet it happens.